It is now my absolute pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening, Chief Brendan Mitchell. Brendan was born in Brook, Newfoundland and Labrador, where he continues to reside with his wife, Sheila Lasaga. Brendan has extensive work experience in the areas of project management, materials management, transportation, and procurement management. He holds a Bachelor of Science, Biology, and a Master of Business Administration, MBA, degrees from Memorial University of Newfoundland. His organizational involvements are many, having served on boards and committees locally, provincially, and nationally. He is also an honorary Lieutenant Colonel of the 2nd Battalion of the Newfoundland Regiment. As Qalipu Chief, he is committed to the ongoing development of the Qalipu people I will start that line again. As Qalipu Chief, he is committed to the ongoing development of Qalipu on behalf of its people and communities. Particularly, key areas of focus include member access to culture, teachings and language initiatives, expanding membership services, strategic growth, program benefit sustainability, increased organizational self-sufficiency through direct business ownership, and greater involvement with communities. He endeavors to improve governmental relations at municipal, provincial, and federal levels, and he promotes positive change in fostering a prosperous tomorrow for all. He plans to work together with council and staff at Qalipu in doing the right things right for the Qalipu Nation, putting our people and communities first, and doing so with respect, honesty, integrity, and true dedication. Ladies and gentlemen, Chief Brendan Mitchell. Thank you. Chief Mitchell, I offer you this tobacco for your remarks at our conference opening this evening and for your ongoing guidance and insight in the months and years to come.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'll just give this a little white for you.
Great, Abjalazi. Hi, and welcome everyone. I was kind of pleased to hear all those kind words. I said, are they talking about me or somebody else? Anyway, it's great to be here in Brook, and I'd like to say a sincere welcome to all of you to our beautiful city. I'm glad you're here. I want to welcome the delegates, the mayors, the deputy mayors, the councilors, the staff that are here, Minister Howell. And it's always great to have an opportunity to be on the same stage with Mayor Jim Parsons, who, by the way, is a member of Qalipu First Nation. So we're very fortunate to have an individual involved with our organization, a Mi'kmaq person in a lead position at City Hall here in Brook. So thank you, Jim. I'd like to say to all of you, congratulations on your being elected to your municipal councils. You have a tremendous responsibility and opportunity now to do what I call paying it forward in your communities. This is your opportunity to give back to your people and communities. I'm a big supporter of education. We spend $8 million a year at Qalipu First Nation educating our young people every year. I like it because it gives young people an opportunity to do something better for themselves, for their families today and their future families. But there's another important aspect to education, and it applies to all of you. When you get an education, you get an opportunity to pay it back, and you become the mayors and the deputy mayors and the councilors and help your communities tremendously because you take your responsibilities serious and you're effective in your roles. The topic of tonight's presentation is Journey to Reconciliation. So here I am looking for this little device here. In home, my father used to say, hand me the clicker. At work, they'd tell me I'm cell phone and computer challenged, so I need Eastern Audio to help me as we go along here tonight. By way of a bit of history of Qalipu, we've been on our own journey to reconciliation. And that journey is on a road that has many steps and many paths sometimes. We just don't push a button to say we're going to have reconciliation in Canada now, and we're going to have reconciliation in Newfoundland and Labrador. I'm going to tell you about reconciliation tonight, because maybe many of you or some of you haven't been much involved in the reconciliation aspect. But I'll tell you why it's important for you to think about what I'm going to tell you tonight. I'm going to have some suggestions for you a little later on in this presentation also. Our pathway to reconciliation actually started a long time ago. In 1949, when Newfoundland joined Confederation, and prior to that, in 1948, Joseph Smallwood was asked by the federal government, are there any Indians in Newfoundland? And Mr. Smallwood said, no, there aren't. And I'm sure Canada went with a sigh of relief, because they didn't have to negotiate a deal with us, with Indigenous people, because it would have taken time. And maybe for Mr. Smallwood, it might have slowed down the process to joining Confederation. Because federal government people often like to dot the I's and cross the T's, and they didn't like to get involved in a process. Well, once they did, they had to get involved properly and do it right. The other thing that Mr. Smallwood was trying to do in 1949, of course, is to get a referendum to get the province into Confederation. It took two referendums, by the way. The second one went by a very small margin, I believe around 1%. What do you think would have happened if Mr. Smallwood had said to Government of Canada, we have Indigenous people? And Canada would have said, name them, identify them, and how many are there? What could not Indigenous people do in 1949? They couldn't vote. So Mr. Smallwood needed everybody to vote in 1949. That may be another reason why the conversation was held or had, that there were no Indigenous people or no Indians in Newfoundland. There was a real significant event that happened for Qalipu First Nation in September 22nd of 2011. We became a First Nation. We received Indian Act status. It was an incredible moment. The struggle in what I call the modern days of the Aboriginal movement in Newfoundland began in the early 1970s, when people said we have to work toward recognition for our people. We were left out of the terms of the agreement in 1949. So they struggled, threatened with court cases. It took decades to get where we are today, to form Qalipu First Nation. An incredible moment for us, really. And I'm not saying the process to our recognition and the formation of Qalipu First Nation was perfect, because we have a lot of unhappy people, and you know some people that lost status in 2018, some who never got into our band at all. But we have a band today with 24,000 members. We are the largest individual Indian Act band in this country. We are big and we're significant. The only group in Canada larger than us overall is the Six Nations of the Grand River. We call the Six Nations Reserve near Brantford, Ontario. There are 25,800 people involved in that organization. But they're not an individual group like we are as Mi'kmaq people. They're made up of tribes: Cayuga, Oneida, Seneca, Onondaga, Tuscarora, and Mohawk. We are large. I want to tell you why reconciliation might be important today, just based on the sheer numbers of people who are Indigenous in Newfoundland and Labrador. If I ask you how many people are Indigenous in Newfoundland and Labrador, I'd hear numbers of anywhere from 30,000 to 100,000 or 120,000. When we consider that 103,000 people self-identified as being Mi'kmaq in the Qalipu enrollment process, they self-identified by saying, I am Mi'kmaq. Out of that 103,000, 24,000 members today have status in this country. If I want to add in the Conn River Band at Mobobec First Nation, 750 thereabouts on reserve, and about 2,000 more people living off reserve but connected to that band. If I want to continue with the Nunatuhuvut Community Council in Southern Labrador, a Southern Labrador Inuit, about 6,000. If I wanted to include the Sheshashi Innu and the Mashawa Innu in Netwashish. We can probably come up with another 4,000 or 5,000. And if I was to include Nunatsiavut, I can probably come up with another 3,000 or 4,000. That gets us to a number starting to approach 130,000 Indigenous people living in or connected to this province. Qalipu First Nation is made up of 67 recognized Indigenous communities. Some of these communities are your communities. In addition to that, though, we have 104 communities that are considered in and around those 67 communities, meaning they're within a 20-kilometer radius from the center of those communities, reaching out to incorporate or include others. It's incredibly large when you come to think of it. So as Indigenous people in this province, we look at the Innu people, the Innu, the Southern Labrador Innu, and the Mi'kmaq people. We have a lot of communities that are part of all of that community. And for you as municipal councils, you have many of our people living in your communities now. That's why it's important to talk about reconciliation. And I was so pleased when I was given the topic of reconciliation. We've come a long way at Qalipu First Nation in a very short time. I have a short video that I'd like to share with you that provides a bit of a background around who Qalipu First Nation really is. Who are our people? Unless hopefully I can get this going.
Qalipu means caribou, and like the caribou, generations of Mi'kmaq people have roamed far and wide, building what is the oldest living culture in Newfoundland. It's a culture that some of us have always lived. Some have lost and are reclaiming it again, and some are discovering for the first time. And while we find ourselves on our own unique points on this path of discovery, we are growing. Part of that growth means coming together as a community while educating our youth, learning from the wisdom of our elders, protecting our environment, promoting our tourism industry, building a strong economy, and inspiring the well-being of our people in mind, body, and spirit. We are a proud people, ever connected by the land, our past, and our future. A future we are building together. The word Mi'kmaq comes from the word Nigma, meaning my kin friends or allies. To our kin friends, our allies, know our strength as a community makes us stronger. Our connection is powerful. Our path is true. We are Qalipu.
Just a short video to tell you a bit about our story and our path on the road to reconciliation. I've been asked to talk about truth and reconciliation tonight. Let's define truth and reconciliation. The truth aspect of truth and reconciliation is what happened and is still happening today in the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians, particularly what's happened and what is happening today in the relationship between Indigenous people and federal, provincial, and yes, municipal governments. That's the truth. What went on? What's going on? The reconciliation aspect is extremely important. It involves the acknowledgement and acceptance by all Canadians regarding what happened and is still happening in these relationships today. In other words, the truth. It also involves having the willingness for atonement, moving forward together in the spirit of mutual respect and positive change. I'll say it again. Moving forward in the spirit of mutual respect and positive change. That's the important reconciliation aspect that this country is trying to work toward. You can have atonement in this world and not have mutual respect and change. A quick example would be a person driving a car at 150 kilometers on the highway, gets pulled over by the RCMP or some police force, gets their car impounded, loses their license, and gets a big fine. I don't know, maybe $1,000 or more. That's atonement, isn't it? But if that individual goes back on the highway when nobody's watching and is driving 140 or 150 kilometers an hour, we didn't get mutual respect, did we? We didn't get respect for the regulations. And yes, we didn't get respect either for a passenger that may be in that vehicle driving 150 kilometers an hour. And we certainly didn't get positive change. So we can have atonement without mutual respect and positive change. So where are we headed as a country? And what prompted the conversation around truth and reconciliation in this country? Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we call it the TRC, was established in 2008 through a legal settlement between residential school survivors, the Assembly of First Nations, Inuit representatives, and the parties responsible for the creation and operation of residential schools. These parties are the federal government primarily and church bodies. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission presented its final report in December of 2015 on Parliament Hill. I had the absolute honor of being there when that was being done. I was in Ottawa on business, and I made contact with Member of Parliament, now Minister of Rural Economic Development, Goody Hutchings, and she invited me to go to Parliament Hill to see the Truth and Reconciliation Commission make its report. It was a very emotional time, I can tell you. A lot of work went into this, a lot of meetings, a lot of interviews with people. It was an incredible time, really. And I'd just like to share with you a video that was made by Justice Murray Sinclair, who was the chairperson of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. My page got out of sync here that time. Anyway, the final report of Truth and Reconciliation presented in 2015 talked about 10 principles of reconciliation, and there were 94 calls to action. Those calls to action have been started, but we're a long way from getting where we need to be with respect to the whole aspect of completing the work of the Commission and putting those items in place. To give you another example, there was another report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in this country. The final report was presented in 2019 in September. There were 232 calls of action. I don't think the first 20 of them have been enacted yet. So there's a lot of work to do, isn't there, as we endeavor to create a better tomorrow for people in this country, particularly Indigenous people. Here we go. The gentleman on the left is the Honorable Murray Sinclair, a senator and judge. The man in the middle is Chief Wilton Littlechild. He was involved with the commission, and Dr. Marie Wilson was also there. So these people worked very hard, as I said a moment ago, had a tremendous number of interviews with people involved in a residential school side. So it was a residential school that prompted a conversation regarding truth and reconciliation, a conversation that happens every day in this country right now. You hear it in the news. We're fortunate to have a prime minister who at least is trying to do something regarding truth and reconciliation. I'll talk to you in a moment about our own province and what our own Premier Andrew Furey is doing about reconciliation. Now I'll come to the video.
Hello everybody, I'm Murray Sinclair. I'm the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. I want to talk to you for a few minutes about the issue of reconciliation. I'm the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation very important to us in Canada here at the Commission. I want to talk to you for a few minutes about the issue of reconciliation, something which of course is very important to us here at the Commission, but also is of interest and importance to a lot of people in Canada. One of the things that we at the Commission have discovered is that it took us a long time to get to this point in terms of the relationship between Aboriginal people in this country. 7 generations of children went through the residential schools, and each of those children who were educated were told that their lives were not as good as the lives of the non-Aboriginal people of this country. They were told that their languages, their cultures were irrelevant. They were told that their people and their ancestors were heathens and pagans and uncivilized and needed to give up that way of life to come to a different way of living. At the same time that that was going on, non-Aboriginal children in in the non-Aboriginal school systems of this country, we're also being told the same thing about Aboriginal people. So as a result, many generations of children, including you and your parents, have been raised to think about things in a different way, in the wrong way, in a way that is negative when it comes to Aboriginal people. And we need to change that. It was the educational system that has contributed to this problem in this country. And it's the educational system, we believe, that's going to help us to get away from this. We need to look at the way that we educate children. We need to look at the way that we educate ourselves. We need to look at what it is that our textbooks say about Aboriginal people. We need to look at what it is that Aboriginal people themselves are allowed to say within the educational system about their own histories. In addition to that, we also believe that what's important when it comes to looking at the way that children are educated is to understand that because it took us so many generations to get to this point, it's going to take us at least a few generations to be able to say that we are making progress. We cannot look for quick and easy solutions because there are none. We need to be able to look at this from the perspective of where do we want to be in 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 generations from now when we talk about the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in this country. And if we can agree on what that relationship needs to look like in the future, and what we need to think about is what can we do today that will contribute to that objective. Reconciliation will be about ensuring that everything that we do today is aimed at that high standard of restoring that balance to that relationship.
That was an important video. And Maurice Sinclair was a chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I think he hit a number of key points as we went along there. And the path to reconciliation, I said earlier, is not a quick one. It's not short. It'll take decades. He refers to generations before we get into a place where reconciliation has been accepted, adopted, and allows everybody in this country to think about one another in a very different way. Far too much racism and discrimination in this country, racism regarding people of color, people of religion, different religions, people of different sexual preferences. And we see it and hear it every day in the national news, and yes, sometimes it hits home right in our own communities. Racism is alive and well, discrimination is alive and well. So we have a lot of work to do. Truth and Reconciliation promotes the belief that confronting and reckoning with past actions and relationships are necessary for a successful transition from conflict, mistreatment, resentment, and tension to a state of peace, respect, and improved relations. Senator Maurice Sinclair, chairperson of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, stated, "For reconciliation to work and for our relationship to be renewed, there must be awareness, acceptance, apology, atonement, and action." I like the word action because we can talk about reconciliation forever and not do anything about it and never improve the situation that we face in this country and the situation we face here in Newfoundland and Labrador. We need action. A reconciliation framework is one in which Canada's political and legal systems, educational and religious institutions, corporate sector, and civil society function in ways that are consistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We refer to it as UNDRIP, which Canada has endorsed. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission believes that the following guiding principles of truth and reconciliation will assist Canadians moving forward. I'm going to quickly go through these. Principle number 1, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a framework for reconciliation at all levels, across all sectors of Canadian society. Principle 2, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples of this country and as self-determining peoples have treaty, constitutional, and human rights that must be recognized and respected. Reconciliation is a process of healing relationships that requires public truth sharing, apology, commemoration that acknowledges and redresses past harms. On the note of reconciliation being about healing relationships, there are times in our own families when we may have to turn to reconciliation. Have you ever been into an argument with your spouse and you haven't spoken for a day or two? Have you had a problem with one of your children? You haven't got along very well in a while. Have you ever seen this happen or heard of it happen? A man and a woman are in the kitchen, and the man says to a child, "Tell your mother I need a loaf of bread or a slice of bread." These things actually happen. So we can have reconciliation in front of us in so many places. I know of a brother and sister that haven't spoken in 16 years over some foolish thing that happened 16 years ago. Do you think there's an opportunity for reconciliation? Absolutely. Reconciliation requires constructive action in addressing the ongoing legacies of colonialism that have had destructive impacts on Aboriginal peoples, education, cultures, languages, health, child welfare, administration of justice, and economic opportunities and prosperity. So we do need constructive action. If I had time, I'll tell you about the situation regarding Indigenous people in this country who are incarcerated. It's astonishing and shocking to see the numbers of Indigenous people that are incarcerated today, men and women. Maybe another time we can talk about that. Reconciliation must create a more equitable and inclusive society by closing the gaps in social, health, and economic outcomes that exist between Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal Canadians. Life is better for non-Aboriginal people in this country. They don't have the same problems sometimes that Aboriginal people have, the same living conditions. We have far too many Indigenous communities in Canada that don't have drinkable running water yet. Things that we take for granted often in Newfoundland. And we do have boilers in some of our communities too, maybe some of your communities. But some of these communities have had water problems ongoing for more than 40 years. And they're crying out to the government of Canada and say, when are you going to help us with this? Lots of work to be done. All Canadians as treaty peoples share responsibility for establishing and maintaining mutually respectful relationships. Principle number 7, the perspectives and understanding of Aboriginal elders and traditional knowledge keepers of the ethics, concepts, and practices of reconciliation are vital to long-term reconciliation. Principle number 8, supporting Aboriginal people's cultural revitalization and integrating Indigenous knowledge systems, oral histories, laws, protocols, and connections to the land into the reconciliation process are essential. Today, this afternoon upstairs, I saw a presentation made by Paul Pike on behalf of the people of the Don Indigenous Friendship Center at Stephenville. It's a shame that not too many people were there to hear this story, a story about the Indigenous history of people in Atlantic Canada and in Newfoundland. There was a lot to be learned from what Paul had to say there. Reconciliation, principle number 9. Reconciliation requires political will, joint leadership, trust building, accountability and transparency, as well as substantial investment of resources. And in your relationship with your Indigenous communities, you may be asked someday to kind of share resources and help out there. It's one of the responsibilities that you may decide to take on in Newfoundland and Labrador at some point. Principle 10, reconciliation requires sustained public education and dialogue, including youth engagement. Mary Sinclair referred to the importance of youth and the importance of schooling. How many times have we heard, I'm almost ashamed to say this, how many times have we heard in the school system in Newfoundland that the Mi'kmaq were brought over to Newfoundland to kill off the Beothuk? My goodness, this is what we're teaching our young people. That was not true. Mi'kmaq people got along very well with the Beothuk, and they helped one another. These are some of the fallacies that we hear about in our school system today. We need to understand the history and legacy of residential schools, treaties, and Aboriginal rights, as well as historical and contemporary contributions of Aboriginal peoples to Canadian society. Truthfully, Canadians must do more than just talk about reconciliation. We must learn how to practice reconciliation in our everyday lives within ourselves. Reconciliation begins right in here in each one of us. We have to embrace reconciliation. within ourselves, our families, and in our communities, government's place of worship, schools, and workplaces. To do so constructively, Canadians must remain committed to the ongoing work of establishing and maintaining, here it is again, respectful relationships. It's such an important word in moving forward. Have mutual respect, have respect for one another. Without respect, we're not going to get positive change. I encourage everybody here to think more about that word, respect. Here's the truth about reconciliation. Avoidance is not a pathway to reconciliation. I told this to a federal minister recently when he announced to me that he was walking away from an important conversation we were having about membership in Qalipu First Nation, wanted to pause the conversation or the discussion. I wrote him back, and I reminded that minister that avoidance is not a pathway to reconciliation. Reconciliation does require sincere and, yes, respectful engagement. Is where we need to be heading in this country, and yes, where we need to be moving in Newfoundland and Labrador. What about our province and reconciliation? You should be asking yourself, how are we doing in the province? How is our government doing with respect to reconciliation and their relationship with Indigenous people in Labrador, people here on the island? I'm really pleased to announce that Premier Andrew Furey clearly supports and promotes reconciliation in this province. We have a Minister of Indigenous Affairs and Reconciliation. A Minister of Indigenous Affairs and Reconciliation. It's the Honorable Lisa Dempster. I've had many engagements with Minister Dempster. She's been to many of our events, and she gets it. Premier Andrew Furey gets it. And I hear he's going to be here with you tomorrow to talk about things. And I believe he's speaking at an event here on Saturday. I think you'll enjoy chatting with him. Maybe you should ask him about reconciliation. Some other aspects of reconciliation by the province, one of them is the repatriation of the Beothuk remains from the Museum of Scotland. Have you heard that's happening? It has already happened last year. There was a project that was initiated by Chief Mazel Joe from Conn River, Municipalities First Nation, and Dwight Ball, as Premier, was very much involved. So those Beothuk remains are now at rooms in St. John's, at the rooms. We're trying to find a final resting place. Some people suggest it should be around central Newfoundland, where the Beothuk people were known to be inhabiting and traveling. Renaming of Red Indian Lake to Beothuk Lake created a bit of a controversy, particularly in central Newfoundland. Some people found the term Red Indian offensive. We were asked as Indigenous leaders to talk to the Premier and others about what were our thoughts on renaming Red Indian Lake. Most people are satisfied to name it Beothuk Lake, and that will be forthcoming. There's a project right now to erect an Indigenous statue at the Confederation Building. Another important aspect of acknowledging Indigenous people, another important aspect of reconciliation. We recently established a provincial holiday here in Newfoundland in conjunction with our National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, which was September 30th. Our own province came on board early with that process and saying we need to establish a provincial day to recognize truth and reconciliation efforts and the impacts on Indigenous people for all these centuries. Newfoundland came in with British Columbia, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, PEI, Yukon, and Northwest Territories. But to this day, some provinces haven't got on board yet. Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick. But I'm thinking by 2022, these provinces will have come on board and will be naming themselves a provincial holiday associated with National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. There are celebrations in a lot of our communities. I'm hoping, and maybe some of these celebrations happen in your communities. Our province recognizes National Indigenous Peoples Day, June 21st. An important day to recognize and acknowledge the contribution that Indigenous people have made to the development of Canada. This is a federal day, National Indigenous Peoples Day. Another important milestone in acknowledging Indigenous people in this country. We also have now the annual Premier's Indigenous Roundtable. It was held in Corner Brook just recently in October. So the Indigenous leaders came together with the Premier and some of his cabinet members. There were 4 ministers there, including Minister Lisa Dempster. There were representatives from friendship centers, other organizations in Newfoundland and Labrador, women's organizations particularly. The Newfoundland Aboriginal Women's Network was represented there, plus others. And it was an opportunity for us to talk to the Premier. It wasn't about hearing the Premier talk to us, it was about the Premier hearing about our issues, and yes, our opportunities. This is a very important event. We started it in St. John's a few years ago, came to Corner Brook, and the next time we were supposed to have this was in 2020, and the deal was we were going to go to Goose Bay. But what happened in that time that impacted all this, it was COVID-19, so we couldn't go to Goose Bay. So this year, just recently, we came to Corner Brook. Maybe next year we'll be in Goose Bay. But this is an important item that was started, by the way, by former Premier Dwight Ball. He also had a great sense of who Indigenous people are in this province and why government need to be working with them and supporting them. Every week we have a conference call with Premier Fury, the 5 Indigenous leaders and some of the staff. And again, we're represented with Qalipu First Nation, Malbubek First Nation and Con River, the Natunutuavut Community Council, Todd Russell's group, the Labrador Innu from Sheshashi and Natwashish, and we also have Nunatsiavut there, represented always by President Johannes Lamp. There's no other province in the country doing this, and I'm hearing that some of the premiers in this country are jealous of the relationship that we have with Premier Fury. He's interested in working with us. He may not be Indigenous, but he got a great sense of Indigenous, and I think he may have an Indigenous heart. He's a good guy, and we like working with him, and we're so proud right now that he is our Premier because he's paying attention to Indigenous people. He's given us the consideration and the respect that Indigenous people deserve, and he's become a model for other premiers in this country, and we're so pleased about that. Just recently, in this past summer, we opened up a garden at the Majestic Lawn. I encourage you to go there while you're here. It's called Miigwech Garden. Miigwech is a Mi'kmaq word for I remember. It's a memorial garden to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in our own communities, yes, and across Turtle Island, across North America. It's a place where people come to reflect, family members particularly of those missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. But many people come there to sit in peace, in comfort, in quiet, to reflect on many things. I hope while you're here, you get a chance to drop by and take a look at it. It's an impressive place. We built Miigwech Garden with the support of the federal government, but you know what? It was a joint issue or joint venture with 5 municipalities in this area. So municipalities have gotten involved in Miigwech Garden. I'll come back to your own role in all of that in a moment. So these are important things for us. What does reconciliation mean for municipalities? As I said earlier, many of our members are members of your communities already. How do you embrace them? What do you do to acknowledge Indigenous people? We have a term in the world of indigeneity called two-eyed seeing. It's an important concept in cross-cultural reconciliation. So you need to look at your municipalities through both Western eyes, modern eyes, and through the eyes of Indigenous people that make up your communities. Look around your municipal boundaries for ways to celebrate the Indigenous heritage in your area and to ensure that local landmarks and monuments are named or renamed in a respectful manner. That's something you can do as municipalities. Celebrate. Collaborate with the Indigenous community to celebrate important Indigenous events in your town, such as National Indigenous Peoples Day, and yes, our National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. I want to thank the person who made the land acknowledgement tonight when we started our session. Much appreciated. Include a land acknowledgement in your own public events from time to time. And if your town is in unceded territory of an Indigenous people, celebrate it by flying the Mi'kmaq flag or Grand Council flag. We have a lot of these flags flying right now. In 2019, the town of Stephenville was one of the first to put a flag up permanently in the town of Stephenville. This past year, we've now fly the Mi'kmaq Grand Council flag permanently at the city of Corner Brook in the atrium. It's also flown at Grenfell campus. It's being flown in Grand Falls, Windsor, I hear. These are some of the things that we can do. And if you'd like to fly a Mi'kmaq Grand Council flag in your community, get in touch with me. I'll get you a flag. Because I think it's important that you acknowledge the indigenous people of this land and Mi'kmaq people also by flying the Grand Council flag. It's important to acknowledge some of these things. As I said earlier, the pathway to reconciliation is not a short one. It involves many steps. And the things I mentioned to you about what municipalities are doing, what towns and cities are doing, what the province is doing, what we're doing, what the federal government is doing, these are all steps in a long road to reconciliation. Will I see it in my time? No, I won't. I'll be long in Wild Cove on the North Shore in a graveyard by my parents before we get reconciliation settled away in this country. And maybe many of you will be in your own communities also. But we have a job to do as leaders. We have an opportunity because we want to pay attention to truth and reconciliation. We have an opportunity as community leaders to do what? To endeavor to build a better tomorrow for Indigenous people and all Newfoundlanders and Labradorians by what we do in our roles as municipal and community leaders. And that becomes a challenge that I provide to you tonight. We need to be working together. We don't turn our backs. We don't support racism and discrimination. We do what we can to make life better for people who have been put down many times in many places in this country. And it's still going on. It's getting better, but there's a lot of work to do. But we can all make a contribution, all of us, in your roles as municipal leaders and community leaders, in my role as Chief of Qalipu First Nation, in promoting and supporting reconciliation, not only in this country, but in our own communities, and yes, in Newfoundland and Labrador. We will have an opportunity to make life better for all Newfoundlanders and Labradorians when we do this and get involved. My presentation is finished, but I do want to bring two gentlemen to the stage.